Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us as we open another file on the strange and often tragic turns of human events. A ransom note is a lifeline, a cruel thread of hope in a family's darkest hour. It represents a negotiation, a chance for a safe return. But what happens when that lifeline is severed before it's even offered? In today's case, we examine a baffling kidnapping where the ransom note left behind was a paradox, a demand for money with no instructions on how to pay it, plunging a desperate family into a silent, agonizing void. Case 1. The Boulder Enigma. The puzzling kidnapping of a child beauty queen is defined by a bizarre, lengthy ransom note with no follow-up instructions. Our first file opens in a place that, for many, represents a kind of American ideal. Boulder, Colorado, in the mid-1990s, was a city nestled at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, a hub of affluence, progressive thought, and outdoor living. It was considered a safe haven, a landscape of Rockwellian perfection where violent crime was a distant, abstract concept. It was in this idyllic community that the Ramsey family had built what appeared to be a perfect life. John Bennett Ramsey was the patriarch, a man of considerable success and stature. He was the president and CEO of Access Graphics, a billion-dollar-a-year computer services company. He was a former naval officer, a pilot, and the embodiment of quiet, masculine achievement. His wife, Patricia "Patsy" Ramsey, was a former beauty queen herself, crowned Miss West Virginia in 1977. She was a vivacious, charismatic socialite, a dedicated mother who poured her energy into her family and her community. They had 2 children, a 9-year-old son, Burke, and the sparkling jewel of the family, 6-year-old JonBenet. JonBenet was a child who seemed born for the spotlight. With her blonde hair, dazzling smile, and precocious confidence, she was a star in the world of child beauty pageants. Coached by her mother, she collected crowns and trophies, her image captured in countless photographs and videos, a tiny, sequined performer with an adult's poise. The family lived in a sprawling, 15-room Tudor-style mansion on 15th Street, a home that was a testament to their wealth and status, a physical manifestation of the American dream they were living. Christmas of 1996 was, by all accounts, a joyous time for the Ramseys. Their home was lavishly decorated, presents were piled high, and their social calendar was full. On Christmas Day, they attended a large party at the home of their close friends, Fleet and Priscilla White. They returned home late, carrying a sleeping JonBenet from the car and putting her to bed. The house settled into a quiet, post-holiday slumber. It was the last peaceful night the house and the family would ever know. The story, as it was first told, began in the early morning hours of December 26th. Patsy Ramsey would later state that she woke around 5:30 a.m. and went downstairs to make coffee. As she descended the back spiral staircase, her eyes fell upon a piece of paper lying on one of the steps. It was not a single sheet, but 3 pages neatly aligned. She picked it up and began to read. The words she saw plunged her into a world of pure terror. The document was one of the most bizarre and confounding ransom notes in the history of modern crime. It was written in black ink, on paper from a legal pad that belonged to the Ramseys, with a Sharpie pen that also came from inside the house. It was rambling, theatrical, and filled with strange, cinematic phrasing. "Mr. Ramsey," it began, "listen carefully. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. We respect your business, but not the country that it serves." The note demanded a very specific sum of money, $118,000. It was an oddly small amount for an international kidnapping faction, but it was almost the exact value of a bonus John Ramsey had recently received from his company. The note continued with a chilling threat. If we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies. If you alert bank authorities, she dies. If the money is in any way marked or tampered with, she dies. You will be scanned for electronic devices, and if any are found, she dies. The note warned them against contacting the police or anyone else. It promised that a phone call would come with instructions for the money drop. You'll be instructed to withdraw $118,000 from your account. $100,000 will be in $100 bills, and the remaining $18,000 in $20 bills. At 8 to 10 a.m. tomorrow, I will call to instruct you on delivery. The note ended with a final, ominous sign-off. Victory. SBTC. Patsy screamed. She ran to JonBenét's room and found the bed empty. In a state of panic, she and John searched the house for their daughter, but she was gone. At 5:52 a.m., despite the note's explicit warning, Patsy Ramsey picked up the phone and dialed 911. Her voice on the recording is a frantic, almost hysterical wail, struggling to explain to the dispatcher that her daughter was gone, that there was a ransom note. This was the moment the investigation began. And it was the moment the investigation began to go catastrophically wrong. When the first police officer, Rick French, arrived, he did not secure the house as a crime scene. He saw the note, he saw the distraught parents, and he perceived the situation as a kidnapping in progress. He allowed John and Patsy to call friends and family. Within an hour, the Ramsey home, a potential crime scene of immense importance, was filled with people. Their friends, Fleet and Priscilla White, John and Barbara Fernie, and the family's pastor arrived. They offered comfort, made coffee, and walked freely throughout the house, their movements and presence potentially contaminating any evidence the kidnapper might have left behind. John Ramsey, a man known for his calm, decisive nature, seemed to take charge. He made calls to his pilot to prepare his private plane for a potential ransom delivery. He coordinated with his business to arrange for the cash. The house was a hub of frantic activity, a command center for a rescue mission. But at its core, the entire operation was waiting for one thing, the promised phone call. The note had been explicit. I will call between 8 and 10 a.m. The minutes and then hours of that morning ticked by with agonizing slowness. Police installed a wiretap on the phone lines and FBI agents began to arrive. Everyone waited. 8 a.m. came and went. Then 9 a.m. The house was thick with tension and the silent, unspoken fear that with every passing minute of silence, the hope of a safe return was diminishing. 10 a.m. arrived. The phone remained silent. The kidnappers had not called. The one thread of communication, the one lifeline offered in the rambling note, had been a lie. The family was left in a terrifying void, with the demand for money but no instructions on how to deliver it. The note, which had been the catalyst for the morning's terror, was now becoming something else, a deeply suspicious artifact. As the day wore on without any contact, the investigators' focus began to subtly shift. The initial theory of a professional kidnapping was starting to crumble under the weight of its own inconsistencies. The note was too long, too personal. It was written on a pad from inside the house, suggesting the author had spent a significant, unhurried amount of time there. The ransom amount was too specific, too connected to John's bonus. This small foreign faction seemed like a clumsy, fictional construct. The entire document felt staged. The suspicion, unspoken at first, began to creep into the minds of the detectives. What if there was no kidnapper? What if the crime had originated from within the walls of this very house? Around 1 p.m., Detective Linda Arndt, who had been at the house for hours, felt a growing unease with the passive nature of the investigation. The house had not been properly searched. She suggested to John Ramsey that he and his friend, Fleet White, conduct a top-to-bottom search of the home to see if anything seemed out of place or unusual. It was a decision that would change the course of the investigation forever. John Ramsey and Fleet White started their search. They began upstairs and worked their way down. Finally, they reached the basement. It was a sprawling, cluttered space with several rooms. John went directly to a small, windowless room that was used for wine storage. He opened the door. The room was dark. He reached inside and flicked on the light. And there on the floor was his daughter. JonBenét's small body was wrapped in her favorite white blanket. Her mouth was covered with a strip of black duct tape. A nylon cord was tied tightly around her neck, and another was tied around her wrists. The cord around her neck was attached to a small wooden stick, the broken handle of a paintbrush that had been twisted to create a makeshift garrote. John Ramsey let out a cry of anguish. He knelt down, ripped the duct tape from his daughter's mouth, and gathered her body into his arms. He carried her up the stairs from the basement, his movements shattering what was left of the crime scene. "My baby," he screamed, laying her down on the floor of the living room, in the midst of the assembled friends and police officers. In that instant, the kidnapping case became a homicide investigation. The fragile hope that had sustained the family and police throughout the morning was extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. JonBenet had never been kidnapped. She had been in the house the entire time, hidden away in a dark corner of the basement, less than 100 feet from where her mother had found the ransom note. The discovery of the body intensified the focus on the note and on the family. The note was no longer a communication from a kidnapper. It was a piece of deliberate misdirection, a carefully crafted fiction designed to send police on a wild goose chase while the body remained hidden. It was a 2.5-page lie. The autopsy would later reveal the full horror of JonBenét's final moments. The cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation, associated with a severe head injury. She had suffered an 8-inch fracture to her skull, a blow so powerful it would have caused immediate unconsciousness or death. There were also signs of a vaginal injury, suggesting a sexual assault had occurred. In her stomach, medical examiners found pineapple, a detail that became significant when neither John nor Patsy could recall giving her any pineapple before she went to bed. A bowl of pineapple with a spoon in it was later found on the kitchen counter. The investigation now followed two divergent paths, creating a schism that has defined the case for decades. The first path was the intruder theory. This theory held that an unknown assailant broke into the house, subdued JonBenet, and wrote the elaborate ransom note as a decoy. Proponents of this theory point to several pieces of evidence: a broken basement window, a suitcase found placed beneath it that could have been used as a step, an unidentified boot print in the basement dust, and, years later, the discovery of a small amount of touch DNA from an unknown male on her long johns. This theory suggested a predator had targeted the family, perhaps someone obsessed with JonBenet from her pageant life, and that the crime was a botched kidnapping that turned into a murder and sexual assault. In this scenario, the Ramseys are innocent, tragic victims, and the note is the work of a cunning, sadistic killer. The second path, and the one that many investigators gravitated towards, was that the crime was committed by someone inside the house. This theory posited that there was no intruder and that the scene was elaborately staged to cover up the truth. The note was central to this theory. Handwriting analysis was conducted on both John and Patsy. While John was quickly ruled out, experts stated that Patsy could not be definitively excluded as the author. In fact, the writing on the note shared many of her idiosyncratic characteristics. The legal pad used for the note was found to have indentations from 2 practice drafts. The killer had rehearsed. This theory itself has several subtheories. One suggests that Patsy, In a fit of rage perhaps related to a late-night bedwetting incident struck JonBenet, accidentally causing the fatal head injury. In a state of panic, she and John then conspired to cover up the crime to protect Patsy, staging the kidnapping and strangulation to obscure the original injury. Another version of the family theory points the finger at the 9-year-old brother, Burke. This theory speculates that Burke, perhaps angry at JonBenet for stealing a piece of his pineapple, struck her on the head with a heavy object, like a flashlight, causing her death. The parents, waking to find one child dead and the other responsible, then made the horrific choice to protect their surviving child at all costs, staging the elaborate cover-up. This theory, proponents argue, explains the bizarre, almost theatrical nature of the crime. The garrote, the note, the staged scene is the work of panicked, grieving parents, not a professional criminal. The media frenzy that erupted around the case was unlike anything seen before. The image of the child beauty queen, sexualized and paraded on stage, became a focal point of public fascination and revulsion. The Ramseys, with their wealth, their lawyers, and their carefully managed public appearances, became objects of intense suspicion. Their behavior was scrutinized, their interviews dissected. They were tried and convicted in the court of public opinion long before any real court had a chance to hear the evidence. Over the years, the case has remained a confounding and frustrating puzzle. In 1999, a grand jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death, but the district attorney at the time, Alex Hunter, refused to sign the indictment, citing a lack of sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in 2006, maintaining her innocence to the very end. In 2008, then District Attorney Mary Lacey wrote a formal letter of apology to John Ramsey, stating that new DNA testing, which isolated the unknown male 1 profile, proved the family was not involved. However, subsequent reviews of this DNA evidence have challenged this conclusion, suggesting the sample may be a composite from multiple people or simple contamination, and is not robust enough to exonerate anyone. The Boulder Police Department has always kept the case officially open. To this day, it remains one of the most infamous and perplexing unsolved murders in American history. At its heart lies the Ransom Notia document born of deception, whether from an external predator or an internal one. It was a demand without instructions, a conversation that was never meant to be had. It was a labyrinth of words designed to lead investigators away from the simple, brutal truth of what happened to a 6-year-old girl in her own home on Christmas night. It is the silent, taunting enigma at the center of a tragedy that has no end. Case 2. The Crime of the Century. A nation is gripped by the abduction of its most famous hero's son, with cryptic notes leading to a tragic, futile search. In the annals of American crime, few cases cast as long and dark a shadow as the one we open tonight. It is a story that transcended its own grim details to become a national trauma, a wound on the collective psyche of a country desperate for heroes. It took place during the bleakest years of the Great Depression, a time when the nation looked to figures of extraordinary achievement for a glimmer of hope. And there was no greater hero, no more revered figure in the world at that time than Colonel Charles Augustus Lindbergh. In 1927, Lucky Lindy had become an instant global icon by completing the first solo, nonstop transatlantic flight, a feat of breathtaking courage and endurance. He was the embodiment of American ingenuity, individualism, and quiet strength. He was more than a pilot. He was a living myth. In 1929, he married Anne Morrow, the thoughtful, intelligent, and fiercely private daughter of a U.S. diplomat. She was a poet and an aviator in her own right, a graceful and sensitive counterpoint to her husband's stoic public persona. Their firstborn son, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., born in 1930, was an object of unprecedented public fascination. Dubbed the Eaglet by the press, he was the heir to this American royalty. His every move was documented, his image splashed across newspapers and newsreels. He was a symbol of the future, the child of a national demigod. To escape this relentless public gaze, the Lindberghs sought to build a sanctuary. They purchased a remote plot of land in the Sourland Mountains near Hopewell, New Jersey, and constructed a large stone house they named Highfields. It was their fortress of solitude, a place where they hoped to raise their son in peace, far from the prying eyes of the world. But the very isolation they craved would become their greatest vulnerability. The evening of Tuesday, March 1st, 1932, began like any other at Highfields. Charles Jr., now 20 months old, was suffering from a cold. His nurse, Betty Gow, rubbed a vaporizing ointment on his chest, changed him into a sleeping suit, and put him to bed in his crib in the second-floor nursery around 7:30 p.m. The house settled into its evening routine. Colonel Lindbergh was in his study on the first floor, directly below the nursery. And Lindbergh was also downstairs. A strong, chilling wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the new house. Around 9 p.m., Colonel Lindbergh heard a sharp, cracking sound, like a wooden slat breaking. He gave it little thought, assuming it was the wind or perhaps a piece of furniture breaking. At 10 p.m., Nurse Betty Gow went to check on the baby. She entered the nursery and found the crib empty. She saw that the window near the crib, which she was certain she had latched shut, was now open. Thinking perhaps Mrs. Lindbergh had the child, she went to her room and said she did not have the baby, assuming Colonel Lindbergh had him. A cold dread began to seep into the house. Betty Gow found Colonel Lindbergh and asked him if he had the baby. He did not. A frantic search of the house began. Lindbergh quickly went to the nursery. He saw the empty crib, the open window, and on the windowsill, an object that did not belong, a plain white envelope. He immediately understood. He instructed everyone not to touch anything and called the local Hopewell police. Then he went outside, grabbing a rifle, and began to search the grounds. Beneath the nursery window, he found the first pieces of a horrifying puzzle. There were two distinct indentations in the soft, muddy ground, suggesting the base of a ladder. Nearby, he found a chisel, and lying in the mud was the source of the sound he had heard earlier, a crudely made, three-section wooden ladder. One of the rungs was broken. The ladder was too short to reach the window comfortably, but it was clear what had happened. Someone had scaled the wall of their fortress, entered the nursery, and stolen their son from his crib. When the chief of the Hopewell police arrived, Lindbergh showed him the envelope from the windowsill. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a ransom note that would become the first chapter in a long and agonizing communication with a ghost. The note was written in a cramped, peculiar hand, with glaring grammatical errors and misspellings. It read, "Dear Sir, have 50,000.
Why?
25,000. Ready 25,000. In 20, 15,000. Bills 15,000. In 10, 10,000. Bills and 10,000. In $5 bills. After 2 to 4 days we will inform you where to deliver the money. We warn you for making anything public or for notify the police the child is in gut care. Indication for all letters are signature and 3 holes." At the bottom of the page was a bizarre, hand-drawn symbol. 2 interlocking blue circles, with a solid red circle in the center, and 3 puncture holes punched through the paper. It was a demand for money, but one that offered no immediate instructions, only the promise of future contact. It plunged the most famous family in the world into a state of suspended terror, a helpless wait for a phone call that would never come, or a letter that might never arrive. The news of the kidnapping broke the next morning and spread like wildfire. The crime of the century was born. The nation, and indeed the world, reacted with collective horror and disbelief. Highfields, the family sanctuary, was transformed into the chaotic epicenter of one of the largest manhunts in American history. Police from across New Jersey, New York, and beyond descended on the property. Reporters and photographers laid siege to the estate, their cars clogging the narrow country roads. The crime scene, which should have been meticulously preserved, was irrevocably compromised. Dozens of officials and journalists tramped through the mud, destroying footprints and contaminating potential evidence. From the outset, Colonel Lindbergh, a man accustomed to being in absolute control, found himself at odds with the official investigation, which was led by Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. of the New Jersey State Police. Lindbergh distrusted the police's ability to handle the situation, believing their primary goal was to catch the criminals, while his was singular and absolute: the safe return of his son. He decided to run his own parallel investigation. This decision opened the door to a bizarre and surreal chapter in the saga. Believing the kidnappers might be professionals from the criminal underworld, Lindbergh reached out to two notorious Prohibition-era figures, Auntie Madden and Salvatore Spitali, hoping they could use their connections to make contact. Even Al Capone, from his prison cell in Chicago, offered his assistance in exchange for his release. The line between law enforcement and law-breaking became hopelessly blurred. Days turned into a week, and no further word came from the kidnappers. The silence was maddening. The Lindberghs, desperate, decided to enlist a go-between, someone the kidnappers might trust. They chose a man named Dr. John F. Condon, a 72-year-old retired school principal from the Bronx who had placed an ad in a local paper, the Bronx Home News, offering his services and $1,000 of his own money to the kidnappers. He signed the ad with the pseudonym Jaffe, derived from his initials JFC. To the astonishment of everyone, the kidnappers responded. On March 9th, a letter arrived for Condon, bearing the same strange, three-holed symbol. It instructed him that the next note would be found under a stone at a vacant hot dog stand nearby. A bizarre, cryptic negotiation had begun, with an elderly schoolteacher as the central conduit. Over the next several weeks, a series of notes were exchanged, primarily through classified ads in the newspapers. Jaffe would place ads to signal his readiness, and the kidnapper would respond with new instructions. The notes led Condon on a strange journey through the cemeteries of the Bronx. Lindbergh, often disguised and waiting in the shadows, accompanied Condon on these tense excursions. The kidnapper demanded proof that Condon was the legitimate intermediary. Condon, in turn, demanded proof that the kidnappers had the child. Finally, a package arrived at Condon's home. Inside was the baby's one-piece sleeping suit, the very one he had been wearing on the night of his abduction. It was the proof of life the Lindberghs had been praying for. The kidnapper now raised the ransom demand to $70,000. Lindbergh, agonizing over the decision but feeling he had no choice, agreed. The money was assembled, mostly in gold certificates, which were soon to be recalled from circulation, making them more traceable. The serial numbers of every bill were meticulously recorded. The instructions for the final exchange were the most specific yet. On the night of April 2nd, 1932, John Condon went, as instructed, to St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx. He carried the ransom money in a custom-made wooden box. In the darkness, he heard a voice with a thick German accent call out, "Hey, doctor." It was the kidnapper, a shadowy figure Condon would later refer to as Cemetery John. Condon spoke with him briefly across a cemetery hedge. The man was nervous and jumpy. Condon gave him the box of money. In return, Cemetery John handed him a note. This was the most crucial note of all, the one that held the key to his son's whereabouts. The note claimed that the baby was safe and being cared for by two innocent women. It stated that the child could be found on a boat named Nellie, moored near Martha's Vineyard, off the coast of Massachusetts. A surge of hope, the first in over a month, electrified Lindbergh. He immediately took to the skies in his own plane, flying low over the waters of the Atlantic, scanning every boat, every cove, for a sign of the Nellie. He searched for 2 days, a desperate father combing the vast, empty ocean. But there was no boat named Nellie. There were no two women. There was no child. The awful, crushing realization began to dawn. The instructions in the final note were a lie. The entire negotiation, the proof of life, the payment of the ransom, it had all been a cruel and elaborate deception. The kidnappers had their money, and the Lindberghs were left with nothing but an empty promise and a silence more profound and terrifying than before. The hope that had sustained a family and a nation began to curdle into despair. For 42 more days, the Lindberghs waited in an agony of uncertainty. The investigation continued, but without any leads, it had stalled. Then, on May 12, 1932, the waiting came to a brutal and definitive end. A truck driver named William Allen pulled over on the side of a road near Mount Rose, New Jersey, just 4.5 miles from the Lindbergh estate. He walked a short distance into the woods to relieve himself. There, in a shallow, hastily dug grave, he saw a partially buried human form. It was the body of a small child. Dental records confirmed the unthinkable. It was Charles Lindbergh Jr. The eaglet was dead. The county coroner's examination revealed that the child had a massive fracture to the skull and had been dead for about 2 months. He had likely been killed on the very night of his abduction. The crack that Lindbergh had heard was not the sound of a ladder breaking. It was very likely the sound of his son's head striking the side of the house as the kidnapper clumsily navigated the ladder in the dark. The crime was no longer a kidnapping, it was a murder. The ransom negotiation, the weeks of cryptic notes and false hope, had all been a ghoulish charade performed for a child who was already gone. The investigation now transformed into a manhunt for a killer, and the primary clue was the $70,000 in marked gold certificates. The U.S. Treasury Department led a painstaking, 2-year effort to track every bill as it surfaced. The trail was slow and frustrating. The break finally came on September 15, 1934. A gas station attendant in Manhattan received a $10 gold certificate for a purchase of 98 cents worth of gasoline. The customer was acting suspiciously, and the attendant, mindful of the circulated list of Lindbergh ransom bills, jotted down the man's license plate number on the back of the bill. The bill was indeed from the ransom money. The license plate was traced to a German immigrant and carpenter living in the Bronx. His name was Bruno Richard Hauptmann. On September 19th, police arrested Hauptmann. A search of his home and garage uncovered a staggering amount of evidence. Hidden in the garage walls was $14,600 of the ransom money. A piece of wood from the ladder left at the crime scene was found to be a perfect match to a floorboard in Hauptmann's attic, with identical nail holes and wood grain. Handwriting experts testified that Hauptmann's script was a match for the writer of the 14 ransom notes. And scrawled on the inside of a closet door, they found John Condon's phone number and address. Hauptmann's trial, held in Flemington, New Jersey, in 1935, became a media circus, dubbed the trial of the century. He was charged with extortion and murder. The prosecution built a powerful circumstantial case based on the money, the ladder, and the handwriting. Hauptmann maintained his innocence, claiming the money had been left with him by a friend and business partner, Isidor Fisch, who had since returned to Germany and died. He claimed he was the victim of a frame-up. The jury was not convinced. On February 13th, 1935, they found Bruno Richard Hauptmann guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. After a series of failed appeals, he was executed in the electric chair at the New Jersey State Prison on April 3, 1936. He went to his death proclaiming his innocence. The case left indelible scars. It led to the passage of the Federal Kidnapping Act, commonly known as the Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping a federal crime. For Charles and Anne Lindbergh, the tragedy was a wound that never healed. Hounded by the press and haunted by the memory, they fled America and sought refuge in Europe, their belief in privacy and security shattered forever. The crime had stolen not only their son, but their home. The Lindbergh kidnapping remains a story of profound and layered tragedy. It is the story of a hero made powerless, of a sanctuary violated, and of a nation's innocence lost. But at its core, it is a story about the unique cruelty of a ransom negotiation for a life that had already been extinguished, a series of cryptic, taunting notes that offered only the illusion of hope, and a family left waiting for instructions that could only lead to an empty sky and an unbearable silence. Case 3. A Fortune for a Ghost. The largest ransom ever paid at the time is delivered to kidnappers who have already murdered their victim and have no viable plan. Los Angeles in the 1920s was a city built on celluloid dreams and sun-drenched ambition. It was the Roaring Twenties, and the city was a magnet for those seeking fame, fortune, and a new beginning. In the burgeoning, respectable neighborhoods that spread across the basin, a new class of financiers and businessmen were building dynasties. Among them was Perry Marion Parker, a man of considerable standing and influence. As the president of the First National Bank of Los Angeles, he was a pillar of the financial community, a man whose life was a testament to the virtues of hard work, prudence, and stability. His life with his wife, Geraldine, was centered around their family. They had 2 children, twin daughters named Marion and Marjorie. At 12 years old, they were the embodiment of youthful innocence, inseparable and cherished. The Parker family lived in a beautiful home in the Windsor Square district, a life of privilege and security, seemingly insulated from the darker currents that ran beneath the city's glittering surface. They were a portrait of prosperity, a family whose name was synonymous with trust and respectability. It was this very name, this symbol of success, that would attract the attention of a predator who harbored a deep and twisted resentment, a young man who sought to shatter their perfect world. His name was William Edward Hickman. At 19 years old, he was, on the surface, a young man of considerable promise. He was handsome, articulate, and possessed a keen intelligence that impressed those he met. He presented himself as polite, charming, and ambitious. But beneath this polished veneer lay a profound and dangerous psychopathy. Hickman was a young man devoid of empathy, driven by a grandiose sense of superiority and a chilling capacity for cruelty. His path had crossed with the Parker family once before. He had briefly worked as a clerk at the bank where Perry Parker was president. He was fired for forging checks. Perry Parker had testified against him at the subsequent trial, an act that secured Hickman's conviction. For Perry Parker, it was a minor, unpleasant business matter, quickly forgotten. For William Hickman, it was a deep and unforgivable wound to his narcissistic ego. He developed a festering obsession with the man who had exposed him, a desire for a revenge that was not swift and simple, but elaborate, cruel, and psychologically devastating. He began to plan. The morning of Thursday, December 15, 1927, began as an ordinary school day for the Parker twins. They attended Mount Vernon Junior High School, a place of learning and safety. Sometime that morning, a well-dressed, handsome young man entered the school office. He approached the school registrar, Mary Holt, with a calm and urgent demeanor. He introduced himself as a former employee of Mr. Perry Parker. He told a terrible story. Mr. Parker had been in a severe automobile accident. His legs were crushed. He was in the hospital, and he was asking to see his youngest daughter. The young man knew her name. He was asking for Marion. Mary Holt, seeing the man's apparent sincerity and hearing the urgency in his voice, felt a wave of sympathy and concern. In the 1920s, a school was not the fortress it is today. A plausible story from a well-spoken individual was often enough to gain trust. Believing she was acting in the family's best interest, she went to Marion Parker's classroom. She called the young girl out of her lesson, explaining that her father was hurt and had sent for her. Marion, a sweet and trusting child, did as she was told. She walked out of her classroom, out of the safety of her school, and into the care of the charming young man. He led her to his car, a green Hudson coupe. He opened the door for her. She got in. The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the Los Angeles traffic. It was the last time Marion Parker would be seen alive by anyone who wished her well. Back at the bank, Perry Parker worked, entirely unaware of the lie being told in his name. The school, assuming the story was true, made no attempt to contact him. The deception was perfect in its simplicity. It was not until later that afternoon, when Marjorie came home from school alone, that the first ripples of confusion began. When Perry Parker returned home from a day of work, uninjured and whole, that confusion curdled into sheer panic. A frantic call to the school confirmed the horrifying truth. Marion had left hours earlier with a stranger. She was gone. The agony of not knowing was short-lived. That same evening, the first communication arrived. A telegram, delivered to the Parker home, contained a message that was both a demand and a threat. It was the first move in a calculated game of psychological warfare. The note demanded a ransom of $1,500 in $20 gold certificates, a relatively small sum for a man of Perry Parker's means. It was signed with a single, cryptic name, the Fox. The instructions were vague. It told Parker to await further communication. There was no phone number to call, no address for a drop, only a chilling command to wait. The Parker family was plunged into a state of suspended terror, their home transformed into a waiting room of unbearable tension. Perry Parker immediately contacted the police, and a massive, yet clandestine, investigation began. The kidnapping of the prominent banker's daughter was an immediate sensation, but the police and the family tried to keep a tight lid on the details, hoping to follow the kidnapper's instructions to a degree, in the desperate hope that compliance would ensure Marion's safety. The kidnapper, William Hickman, reveled in the chaos and fear he was creating. He was not just a kidnapper seeking money. He was a sadist enjoying a performance of which he was the sole author and director. He began to send more letters, not just to the Parker home, but to the newspapers, taunting the police and playing a cat-and-mouse game with the entire city. His notes were a bizarre mixture of cold-blooded instruction, theological ramblings, and arrogant boasting. He changed his signature with each new communication, signing them Fate, Death, and even, in one instance, George Fox, a reference to the founder of the Quakers, a strange intellectual flourish that spoke to his inflated sense of self. One letter read, "I am the god of this affair, and I will be stern in my demands. Parker, your daughter, is in my possession. Her life is the forfeit for your folly." The notes were designed not to facilitate a rescue, but to maximize torment. He set up meetings for the ransom drop, sending Perry Parker on desperate, frantic journeys to designated street corners and locations across Los Angeles, only to never show up. Each failed meeting was another twist of the knife, Another demonstration of his absolute control. Perry Parker, a man of power and influence, was rendered utterly helpless, a pawn in a madman's game. He had the money, a small fortune ready to be paid, but he was trying to negotiate with a ghost, a phantom who offered no real instructions, only a series of cruel deceptions. While Perry Parker was being tormented by these false instructions, he had no way of knowing the horrific truth. There was no negotiation to be had. Marion was already dead. Hickman had driven her to his small apartment. Soon after their arrival, he strangled her. He then carried her small body into the bathroom and, with a chilling, surgical detachment, began to dismember her. He cut off her arms and her legs. He disemboweled her, removing her internal organs and stuffing her torso with old rags and towels. He was not just concealing a crime. He was desecrating a child, an act of unimaginable sadism. He kept her remains in his apartment, a gruesome secret hidden in the heart of the city. After 2 days of this psychological torture, Hickman finally decided to claim his prize. On the morning of Saturday, December 17th, he made a final phone call to Perry Parker. The instructions were clear and, for the first time, seemed genuine. The meeting was set for that evening at the corner of Fifth Avenue and Manhattan Place. Parker was to bring the $1,500 in gold certificates. As night fell, Perry Parker drove to the designated location, his heart a frantic drum of hope and terror. He waited. A green Hudson coupe pulled up to the curb. It was the kidnapper. In the passenger seat, Parker could see a figure bundled up in blankets. He could see his daughter's face. She looked pale, but she was there. A wave of overwhelming relief washed over him. He had done it. He was going to get his daughter back. Hickman spoke from the driver's window, his voice calm. He told Parker to hand over the money. Parker, his hands trembling, passed the package of cash into the car. Hickman took it. He then said he would drive to the end of the block and push Marion out. He didn't want Parker to see his license plate. It seemed like a reasonable precaution. Parker readily agreed, his mind focused only on the imminent reunion with his child. The Hudson coupe drove about 100 feet down the street and stopped. The passenger door opened, and the small, bundled figure was pushed out onto the pavement. The car then accelerated, its tires screeching as it sped away into the darkness. Perry Parker ran towards his daughter, his heart soaring. "Marion," he cried out. He reached the small form lying on the street. He knelt down, and in that moment, his world did not just collapse, it was annihilated by a horror so profound it defies language. The figure was not his living, breathing daughter. It was a mutilated effigy. The child on the pavement was a corpse, her body cold and stiff. What he had seen in the car was a grotesque illusion. Hickman had propped her up. To make her appear alive, he had taken wires and threaded them through her eyelids, sewing them open. The face that had looked out at Perry Parker was a dead face, with eyes held open in a permanent, vacant stare. The rest of her body was wrapped in a blanket, hiding the terrible truth of her dismemberment. The scream that escaped Perry Parker's lips was the sound of a soul breaking. The fortune he had paid was for a ghost, a desecrated puppet used as bait in the final, most monstrous act of a cruel charade. The discovery of Marion Parker's mutilated body transformed the city's fear into a cold, hard rage. The manhunt for William Hickman became the single-minded obsession of every law enforcement officer on the West Coast. The details of the crime were so horrific that they galvanized the public in an unprecedented way. Hickman was no longer just a kidnapper. He was a monster, a moral imbecile, as the newspapers would soon call him. The police had a crucial advantage: the ransom money. The gold certificates were traceable. Hickman, now flush with cash, fled north, driving his Hudson coupe up the coast. He left a trail of spent ransom bills in his wake. The police followed the trail, telegraphing ahead to towns in Oregon and Washington, plastering his face on wanted posters. The end came just 5 days later, on December 22nd, in the small town of Echo, Oregon. Police officers Tom Gedane and Buck Llewellyn spotted the green Hudson coupe. They recognized the driver from the posters. They pulled him over. William Edward Hickman, the self-proclaimed fox, surrendered without a fight, a faint, arrogant smile on his face. In his possession, they found the remaining ransom money. Hickman was extradited to Los Angeles. During his transport and subsequent interrogation, he was boastful, showing no remorse. He confessed to the crime in meticulous, chilling detail, describing the kidnapping, the murder, and the dismemberment with a detached pride. He seemed to view his actions as a work of dark genius. His trial was a national spectacle. His defense attorneys attempted an insanity plea, arguing that Hickman was compelled by a supernatural force he called Providence. They claimed he was not responsible for his actions. The prosecution, led by the legendary district attorney Asa Keys, countered with a portrait of a cunning, intelligent, and utterly sane sadist who knew exactly what he was doing. They argued that he was not insane, but simply evil. The jury agreed with the prosecution. After a sensational trial, William Edward Hickman was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to be hanged. On October 19, 1928, at San Quentin State Prison, the sentence was carried out. The case of Marion Parker left a permanent scar on the psyche of Los Angeles and the nation. It was a story that starkly illustrated the vulnerability of innocence in a modern, anonymous world. But more than that, it was a profound study in the nature of evil. Hickman's crime was not born of passion or desperation. It was a cold, intellectual exercise in cruelty. The ransom note with no viable instructions, the false meetings, the final, ghoulish exchange, these were not flaws in a plan to get money. They were the plan itself. The goal was never just to be paid. It was to inflict the maximum possible measure of suffering. In paying a fortune for a ghost, Perry Parker was not just a victim of a kidnapping. He was the audience for a meticulously staged masterpiece of horror. Case 4. The Hollywood Mall Horror. The abduction of a 6-year-old from a department store leads to a brief, cruel ransom call that offers no instructions and no hope. The American shopping mall of the late 1970s and early 1980s was more than just a place of commerce. It was a cathedral of consumerism, a community hub, a brightly lit and air-conditioned sanctuary where families felt safe. It was a self-contained world of familiar logos, music, and the comforting murmur of a crowd. It was perceived as a space utterly removed from the dangers of the outside world. Our next file examines the day that perception was irrevocably shattered, when a predator walked into this bastion of suburban safety and, in a matter of minutes, extinguished the light of one family, sparking a national revolution in how we protect our children. Hollywood, Florida, in 1981, was a sun-bleached landscape of middle-class aspiration. It was a place of single-family homes, bustling commercial strips, and a lifestyle built around the promise of safety and community. It was here that John and Reve Walsh were living their own version of the American dream. John was a successful partner in a hotel development company, a man whose hard work had provided his family with a life of comfort and opportunity. Reve was a devoted wife and mother, her world revolving around their cherished, only child, a 6-year-old boy named Adam. Adam Walsh was a bright, happy, and trusting child. He was the center of his parents' universe, a boy with a wide, toothy grin and a love for the simple joys of childhood. He played baseball, loved the beach, and was just beginning to explore the world with the boundless curiosity of a 6-year-old. The Walsh family was a tight-knit unit, their lives filled with the ordinary, beautiful rhythms of a young family on the rise. They had no reason to believe that their world was anything but secure. Monday, July 27, 1981, was a typical summer day. Reve Walsh needed to run an errand. She was looking for a new lamp for their home. She decided to go to the Hollywood Mall, a sprawling shopping center just a few miles from their house. She took Adam with her. It was a mundane trip, the kind of mother-son outing that happens millions of times a day across the country. They went to the Sears department store, one of the mall's large anchor tenants. Inside the store, Reve began looking at lamps. Adam, like many boys his age at the dawn of the video game era, was captivated by a display of Atari 2600 consoles. He asked his mother if he could watch the older boys play. The video game section was only a few aisles away from the lamp department, well within sight. Reve, judging the environment to be perfectly safe, agreed. She told him to stay put while she continued her shopping nearby. It was a decision, born of innocence and trust in her surroundings, that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was gone for only a few minutes. In that brief window of time, a sequence of events unfolded, small and seemingly insignificant, yet catastrophic in their consequence. A teenage security guard, doing his job, approached the video game display. He saw a group of older boys roughhousing and told them to leave. Adam, small and quiet, was among the group of children standing there. The guard, making no distinction, told him he had to leave, too. The group dispersed. Adam, an obedient child, did as the authority figure told him. He walked away from the video game display, away from the area where his mother expected to find him. When Reve Walsh returned to the spot where she had left her son, he was gone. Her first reaction was not panic, but simple annoyance. She assumed he had wandered off to the toy department, another part of the store he loved. She paged him over the store's intercom system. Adam Walsh, please come to the lamp department. Silence. She paged him again, and again. The annoyance began to curdle into a cold, creeping fear. She began a frantic search of the store, her calls for Adam growing more desperate. She enlisted the help of store employees. They searched every department, every aisle, every dressing room. There was no sign of him. After more than an hour of this fruitless, agonizing search, a store manager called the Hollywood Police Department. The initial response from law enforcement was shaped by the standard procedures of the time. Child abductions by strangers were considered exceedingly rare. The prevailing wisdom was that the child had likely just wandered off and would turn up soon. There was no sense of immediate, critical urgency. To John and Reve Walsh, this bureaucratic calm was a form of torture. Their son was missing, and the world did not seem to be moving fast enough. John Walsh, a man of action and resources, refused to wait. As the police began their methodical, by-the-book investigation, he launched his own. He transformed his business acumen into a desperate search and rescue operation. He left his office and set up a command center in his home. He printed thousands of flyers with Adam's smiling face on them, a new and almost unprecedented approach at the time. He and his friends plastered them on every telephone pole, every storefront window, every lamppost in South Florida. He contacted the media, using his connections to get his son's story on the local news. He offered a reward, which quickly grew to $25,000. He was doing everything in his power to tear through the wall of public and official indifference, to make everyone understand that his son's life was in immediate peril. For 2 days, the Walsh family lived in an agony of the unknown. Every ringing phone sent a jolt of hope and terror through them. Every lead turned into a dead end. The flyers, which had made Adam's face instantly recognizable across the region, generated hundreds of calls, but none of them led to their son. They were trapped in a nightmare of waiting, clinging to the one fragile hope that kept them going, the hope that this was a kidnapping for ransom. A demand for money, however cruel, would be a sign that Adam was still alive. On the afternoon of Wednesday, July 29th, 2 days after Adam disappeared, the phone call they had been both dreading and praying for finally came. John Walsh answered. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, male, and direct. He said he had their son. The caller demanded a ransom of $100,000. John's mind raced. He was trying to process the demand while simultaneously trying to keep the man on the line, to follow the instructions he had been given by the FBI agents who were now part of the investigation. He needed to verify that the caller actually had Adam. He needed to get instructions. "How do I know you have my son?" John asked, his voice strained with a desperate, forced calm. The caller seemed to grow agitated by the question. John, in his panic, continued to press for proof, for information. But he was not dealing with a professional kidnapper who had a clear, thought-out plan. He was dealing with something else entirely. The man on the phone became flustered. He had made his demand, and he seemed unprepared for any kind of negotiation or questioning. Before John could get any instructions where to drop the money, how to make the exchange, any proof of life, the caller abruptly hung up. The line went dead. The silence that followed was more devastating than the demand itself. The single, fragile thread of communication had been severed. There was no way to call back. There was no way to pay the ransom. The caller had presented a demand, but had provided no means to meet it. The one, cruel lifeline that had been offered was snatched away, leaving the Walsh family in a void of profound and absolute helplessness. There would be no second call. There would be no note in the mail. There would be nothing. The failed ransom call was a terrible turning point. The hope that this was a crime motivated by money began to evaporate, replaced by a much darker fear. The investigation continued, but the sense of optimism was gone. The days stretched into a week, then two. Adam's face was on national news, his story touching a nerve across the country. The search was one of the largest in Florida's history, but it yielded nothing. On August 10th, 1981, 2 weeks after Adam walked out of the Sears department store, the waiting came to the most horrific end imaginable. 2 fishermen were in a canal in a rural, undeveloped area of Vero Beach, Florida, more than 120 miles north of Hollywood. They saw something floating near an embankment. As they got closer, they realized with a sickening horror what it was. It was the severed head of a small child. The authorities were called. The medical examiner used dental records to make a positive identification. The head belonged to Adam Walsh. The rest of his body was never found. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. He had been dead for many days, likely since shortly after his abduction. The ransom call, the demand for money, it had all been a lie, a ghoulish postscript to a murder that had already been committed. The news of the discovery of Adam's remains was a final, brutal blow to his family and to a public that had been following the case with rapt attention. The investigation now shifted from a search for a missing child to a hunt for a vicious killer. The case, however, was plagued by a lack of physical evidence and a series of frustrating, inconclusive leads. The break, or what seemed to be one, came 2 years later, in October 1983. A drifter and serial killer named Otis Toole, already in custody for other crimes, confessed to the murder of Adam Walsh. Toole was a terrifying figure, a man of low intelligence, but profound cunning and sadism. He often worked with his partner in crime, Henry Lee Lucas, and together they were suspected of a litany of murders across the country. Toole provided detectives with a detailed confession. He claimed he had been in the Hollywood Mall that day. He saw Adam outside the Sears store after the security guard had told him to leave. He lured the boy into his car with promises of candy and toys. He said he drove around with Adam for a while before the boy started to cry and panic. Toole claimed that he lost his temper, struck Adam, and then strangled him. He later decapitated the body and dumped the head in the Vero Beach Canal. The confessions seemed to fit the known facts of the case. However, there was a problem. Otis Toole was a pathological liar. He confessed to hundreds of murders, many of which he could not have possibly committed. He enjoyed the attention and the power he felt by toying with law enforcement. He would confess, then recant, then confess again, sending investigators on wild goose chases and tormenting the families of victims. Crucially, the police had, at one point, located and impounded the Cadillac that Toole claimed to have used in the abduction. They found bloodstains on the carpet. But in a catastrophic blunder, the car was eventually sold at a police auction, and the blood-stained carpets the most vital piece of physical evidence that could have definitively linked Toole to the crime were lost forever. Without that physical evidence, and with Toole's repeated recantations, prosecutors felt they did not have a strong enough case to secure a conviction. Otis Toole was never charged with the murder of Adam Walsh. He died in prison in 1996 from liver failure, taking whatever truth he knew to his grave. For decades, the case officially remained open and unsolved, a source of enduring pain for the Walsh family and a frustrating enigma for law enforcement. Finally, on December 16, 2008, 27 years after Adam's abduction, the Hollywood Police Department held a press conference. They announced that they were officially closing the case. Based on a comprehensive review of all the evidence and circumstances, they were naming Otis Toole as the killer. It was not a court conviction, but it was a form of official closure, an acknowledgement of what the Walsh family and many investigators had long believed to be the truth. The story of Adam Walsh, however, does not end with his death or the closing of his case file. The profound tragedy of his murder became a catalyst for a national movement. John Walsh, consumed by a grief that would have destroyed most men, channeled his rage and sorrow into a lifelong mission. He refused to let his son's death be just another unsolved statistic. He and Reve became tireless advocates for the rights of victims and the protection of children. They co-founded the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and CMEC, in 1984, a central resource for parents and law enforcement that has since aided in the recovery of hundreds of thousands of missing children. John Walsh lobbied Congress, leading to the passage of the Missing Children's Assistance Act. He became the host of the television show America's Most Wanted, which used the power of media to hunt down fugitives and bring them to justice. He transformed the landscape of law enforcement and public awareness regarding missing children. The days of waiting 24 hours to begin a search, the days of a child's disappearance being treated as a purely local matter, were over, largely because of his relentless efforts. The horror of what happened at the Hollywood Mall was born from a moment of vulnerability and the presence of a predator. The ransom call with no instructions was a final, cruel act of a killer who had no intention of returning the child he had stolen. But the legacy of Adam Walsh is one of profound and lasting change. A little boy's stolen life led to a revolution that has made countless other children safer. His is a story that reminds us of the terrible darkness that can lurk in the most ordinary of places, but it is also a powerful testament to a father's love and how that love, forged in the crucible of unspeakable loss, can change the world. Case 5. The Fox's Cruel Deception. A charming predator kidnaps a young girl, tormenting her family with deceptive notes that lead to a horrifying final exchange. For our final file, we revisit a theme that has woven itself through our previous stories: the predator who sees crime not merely as a means to an end, but as a performance. We return to the West Coast of the United States, decades after the horror of the Marion Parker case, to a community that believed itself to be a safe, modern utopia. It is here that we find a chilling echo of the past, a story of another young girl taken, another family tormented by deceptive notes, and another kidnapper who styled himself the Fox. This case is a study in the evolution of evil, demonstrating how a charming facade can conceal a sociopathic void, and how the hope offered by a ransom note can be the cruelest deception of all. In the late 1970s, the San Francisco Bay Area was the epicenter of a cultural and technological revolution. In the suburban communities that dotted the hills east of the bay, a new kind of affluence was taking root, built on innovation and a progressive, laid-back lifestyle. The town of Hayward, California, was one such community. It was a place of tract homes, good schools, and a strong sense of family-oriented safety. It was here that Stephen and Sharon Stainer were raising their 3 children. The Stainer family was ordinary in the best sense of the word. Stephen worked hard to provide for his family. They were a close-knit, loving unit. Their youngest child was a 7-year-old girl named Carrie. She was a bright, happy first grader, a shy but sweet-natured child who loved her family and felt secure in the world her parents had built for her. Her life was one of school, playdates, and the simple, comforting routines of a suburban childhood. February 15th, 1979, was a Thursday. It was a cold, rainy day. Carrie Stainer, feeling unwell, had stayed home from school. Her mother, Sharon, needed to go to the post office to mail a letter. It was a quick errand, just a few blocks from their home. Carrie asked to come along. Sharon agreed, bundling her daughter into her raincoat. They walked the short distance to the post office. Inside, Sharon told Carrie to wait near the entrance while she went to the counter. The post office was a small, familiar place, seemingly the safest of public spaces. Sharon was gone for only a matter of moments. When she turned back from the counter, Carrie was gone. A familiar pattern of panic and disbelief set in. Sharon searched the post office, her calls for Carrie echoing in the small building. She ran outside, scanning the street, her heart pounding with a fear that was rapidly escalating into terror. There was no sign of her daughter. She had vanished into the rainy afternoon air. The police were called, and an investigation began. But, as in so many cases from that era, the initial response was measured. The prevailing theory was that she had likely decided to walk home on her own. But Carrie was not a child who would do that. As the hours passed with no sign of her, the grim reality began to set in. Carrie had not wandered off. She had been taken. The Stainer family was plunged into a nightmare of waiting. Days turned into a week. There was no word, no demand, no communication of any kind. This silence was, in itself, a form of torture. The family and the community rallied, printing flyers and organizing searches, but every lead went cold. The hope of a safe return began to fade, replaced by a dull, constant ache of dread. Then, 1 week after Carrie's disappearance, a letter arrived at the San Francisco office of the FBI. It was the first communication from the kidnapper. The note was chillingly direct. It stated that Carrie Stainer was alive and well. It demanded a ransom of $100,000 to be delivered by her father, Stephen Stainer. But the instructions for the exchange were bizarrely vague and seemingly impossible to fulfill. The note instructed Stephen to check into a specific motel in a nearby town and await a phone call. The note was signed, ominously, the Fox. For the FBI and the Stainer family, the letter was a double-edged sword. It was a sign that Carrie might still be alive, a fragile thread of hope in the darkness. But it was also the beginning of a cruel and frustrating game. The instructions were a dead end. The kidnapper had provided a location but no time, no date, no way to initiate the contact. It was a demand with no viable path to payment. The FBI, working with Steven Stainer, tried to follow the kidnapper's lead. Steven checked into the designated motel, his room wired for sound, a team of agents waiting discreetly nearby. He waited. The phone never rang. It was the first of many such deceptions. A few days later, a second letter arrived, this one at the family's home. It was typewritten like the first and contained the same signature. This note expressed anger that the instructions had not been followed. It included a new, more complex set of directions for a ransom drop at a location near Lake Tahoe, a resort area hundreds of miles away in the Sierra Nevada mountains. But again, the instructions were a puzzle with missing pieces. They were filled with contingencies and vague timelines that made a successful exchange nearly impossible. It was clear that the kidnapper was not a professional seeking a simple transaction. He was a manipulator, a sadist who was enjoying the power he held over the family and the authorities. The man behind these cruel notes was Kenneth Purnell. In his mid-40s, Purnell was a convicted child molester who had served time in prison. He was a chameleon, a man who could project an aura of harmless, avuncular charm. He often presented himself as a devout Christian, using his feigned piety to gain the trust of both children and adults. In reality, he was a deeply disturbed and predatory pedophile. Purnell's crime was not just to acquire another child. It was to create a twisted, captive family. At the time of Carrie's abduction, Purnell was not living alone. He was living with another boy, a teenager named Steven Stainer. 7 years earlier, in 1972, Purnell had kidnapped 7-year-old Steven as he was walking home from school in Merced, California. For 7 years, Purnell had held Steven captive, subjecting him to horrific abuse while simultaneously raising him as his own son under the alias Dennis Purnell. He moved Steven from town to town, enrolling him in different schools, convincing the boy that his parents had given him away. Steven, taken at such a young age, lived in a fog of manipulation and fear, his memories of his real family slowly fading. When Purnell abducted Carrie, he brought her back to the cabin where he was living with a now 14-year-old Steven. In a moment of supreme psychological cruelty, Purnell introduced Carrie to Steven as his new sister. He forced Steven, his long-term victim, to become an accomplice in the captivity of another child. For Steven, the arrival of Carrie was a profound and terrifying rupture. He saw in her the same innocence he had lost, the same fear he had lived with for half his life. He saw his own past mirrored in her frightened eyes, and he knew, with a certainty born of his own trauma, the grim future that awaited her. While Purnell was playing his sadistic games with the FBI and Carrie's family, sending his taunting, unworkable ransom notes, he was forcing Carrie and Steven into a grotesque parody of family life. He told Carrie the same lie he had told Steven, that her parents no longer wanted her and had given her to him. He instructed the two children to call him Dad. The ransom notes were a pure fabrication, a smokescreen designed for his own amusement and to throw the authorities off his trail. He had no intention of ever returning Carrie. He never attempted to follow through on any of his own instructions because the ransom was not the point. The point was the possession of the children. The notes were merely a feature of the elaborate, delusional world he was constructing. For Steven Stainer, the presence of Carrie in their captive household was a breaking point. The guilt of his forced complicity and the sight of her daily terror began to chip away at the years of brainwashing and fear. He felt a powerful, protective instinct towards the little girl. He knew he could not allow her to suffer the same fate he had endured. After 2 weeks of this nightmarish existence, watching Parnell begin to groom Carrie for abuse, Stephen made a decision that would require immense courage. He decided to escape, and he decided to take Carrie with him. On the night of March 1st, 1980, while Parnell was at work as a night security guard, Stephen acted. He told Carrie they were going to run away back to her real home. Carrie, though terrified, trusted him. He bundled her up, and together, the 14-year-old boy and the 7-year-old girl walked out of the remote cabin and into the darkness. They walked for miles along a dark, rural road until they reached the town of Ukiah. They hitchhiked from there, getting a ride to a local police station. Stephen walked into the station, the small, frightened girl holding his hand, and approached the officer at the desk. "My name is Stephen Stainer," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "And I know this little girl's name is Carrie. I think she's been kidnapped." The police were initially confused. They recognized the name Carrie Stainer from the national news, but they had no idea who the teenager with her was. Stephen began to tell his story, a story of 7 years of captivity, of abuse, of a life stolen from him. As he spoke, the pieces began to fall into place. The police realized they were in the presence of not one, but two victims of the same predator. The reunion of Carrie with her family was a moment of overwhelming, tearful joy, broadcast on news stations across the country. For the Stainers, it was a miracle, the answer to a prayer they had barely dared to utter. For the other Stainer family, the parents of Stephen and Merced, it was a resurrection. They had long ago given up hope of ever seeing their son alive again. The news that he was safe and that he was a hero was a shock that rippled through their family, a joy tempered by the sorrow of 7 lost years. With the children safe, the manhunt for Kenneth Parnell began. He was not difficult to find. He was arrested at work, his web of lies and deception completely unraveled. His trial was a media sensation. Stephen Stainer, no longer a captive but a courageous young witness, testified against the man who had stolen his childhood. His testimony was powerful and damning. Kenneth Parnell was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to just 7 years in prison, a sentence that was widely condemned as shockingly lenient. The judge, in a moment of stunning insensitivity, remarked that he couldn't send Parnell to prison for life for what he did to the boys, because the abuse was a private matter between them. Parnell served only 5 years of his sentence before being paroled. After his release, he was arrested again for attempting to buy a young boy. This time, he was sentenced to life in prison under California's 3 strikes law. He died in prison in 2008. The story of the Stainer children is one of profound tragedy and extraordinary resilience. Carrie Stainer returned to her family, but the trauma of her abduction left a lasting mark. Stephen Stainer, hailed as a hero, struggled to readjust to a world and a family he barely knew. He married, had children, and tried to build a normal life, but the ghosts of his past were never far away. Tragically, in 1989, he was killed in a motorcycle accident at the age of 24. The Stainer family saga, however, held one final, dark twist. Stephen's older brother, Carrie, who had grown up in the shadow of his brother's abduction and heroic return, harbored a deep and secret darkness of his own. In the late 1990s, Carrie Stainer went on a killing spree, murdering 4 women near Yosemite National Park. He would later become known as the Yosemite Park Killer. He claimed his own murderous rampage was a twisted, delayed reaction to the trauma that had engulfed his family decades earlier. The case of Carrie Stainer's kidnapping is a harrowing tale that stands apart. The ransom notes were not a flawed plan for money. They were a fantasy, a cruel and deceptive game played by a predator who had already achieved his true goal. The fox, in this incarnation, was a man whose cruelty was matched only by his delusion. The resolution of the case came not from the payment of a ransom or the work of law enforcement, but from the incredible courage of another child, a boy who, in saving another, finally found the strength to save himself. It is a story that reminds us that even in the deepest darkness, the instinct for freedom and the bonds of shared humanity can spark a light powerful enough to lead the way home. Voiceover, slow, calm, contemplative music begins to fade in. And with that, we close this file. The cases we have examined tonight all share a common, agonizing thread: the torment of a ransom note that offers no real path to rescue. They are stories of false hope, of instructions that lead nowhere, of families left to wait in a silent, maddening void. These narratives expose not just the greed or malice of the perpetrators, but often their incompetence, their delusion, their profound disconnect from reality. They are a testament to the chaos that ensues when the desperate need to save a life collides with a plan that was never meant to succeed. Thank you for joining us here at the Crime Folio. We hope these accounts, though unsettling, serve as a space for reflection on the nature of hope, desperation, and the strange, often illogical, paths that crime can take. May your night be peaceful and your dreams untroubled. Good night.